Welcome to the Exercise is Health podcast, where we're talking about exercise, health, and the interconnectedness of the two. We are your hosts, Charlie
and Julie,
and we will be coming to you every single week from our studio, Muscle Activation Schaumburg.
Hey, welcome back everybody to the Exercise is Health podcast. We are your hosts, Julie
and Charlie.
And we're coming to you from our studio, Muscle Activation Schaumburg, in Schaumburg, Illinois. Now, Muscle Activation Schaumburg, we believe your health is your most valuable asset. Your health is one of the biggest influencers over the quality and quantity of time that you have. And while there's many aspects of health, our expertise is exercise. Exercise has been proven time and again to not only improve your health, but also increase your longevity and improve your quality of life. And today we're going to be talking about a really cool new program that Charlie has created. And I'm going to be interviewing him all about this program because if you have this condition or have a loved one or know someone with this condition, you are not going to want to miss this episode because this is going to be a game changer. Charlie, tell us about your new program. Start with the name of it, of course. And then tell us about what inspired you to create this program.
Yeah, thank you. So the program is called Fit4T1D. So it's fitness for type 1 diabetics. And the whole goal of the program is to try to teach type 1 diabetics how to exercise appropriately to better manage their blood glucose levels. And I was seeing a lot of issues come up with the exercise advice that was given to type 1 diabetics. And we can kind of go into those details, but eventually I just say, okay, well, so much advice that's being given to type 1 diabetics regarding how they should be exercising is either too general to be effective, or it's not specific to people with type 1 diabetes or getting the exact same exercise advice that everybody else was getting. And if you have listened to a number of our episodes, you probably pick up the idea that most of the exercise advice out there is nonsense in some form or another. And this was exercise advice that we were given to type 1 diabetics. And there are big issues with that because of how drastically exercise can impact somebody's blood glucose levels and how much somebody's blood glucose levels can impact their quality of life. So there's a direct tie between how you're exercising and your quality of life if you're a type 1 diabetic, and especially if you're doing it inappropriately, and especially then the drastic difference then when you start to do it appropriately.
Now, before we jump further into this, Charlie, just so that all of our listeners can participate and listen and gain information from this podcast, can you briefly just go over what is type 1 diabetes? Because I know I wasn't completely sure about what that would mean for someone until I met you, and I'm sure some of our listeners that just like to geek out on exercise like we like to may want to just get a little bit of background before we dive into some of the content.
Sure. So diabetes, type 1 diabetes specifically, is an autoimmune condition where essentially the your immune system, or the immune system of a type 1 diabetic, has gone and killed what are called the beta cells of the pancreas. And the beta cells are the cells of the pancreas that produce insulin. And why this is important is because insulin is one of the things that can help glucose from your blood get shuttled into your muscles or shuttled into your fat cells. So it allows glucose to be transported from the blood out of the bloodstream into different types of cells. And so with type 1 diabetes, type 1 diabetics don't have the ability to produce their own insulin. And then as such, they have to take exogenous insulin, or in other words, they have to inject themselves with insulin, or get insulin through like a diabetic pump in order to be able to better shuttle the glucose from their bloodstream or out of their bloodstream into either their muscle cells or their fat cells.
All right. So, Charlie, we have this program, Fit4T1D. Talk to us about some of those common issues that arise. I mean, I know you said that there's these general issues, first of all, that type 1 diabetes patients or clients are given exercise information that is too general to be effective, and there's really no way to get it more specific so that it can be individualized. But So if you could talk about that a little bit, how did you overcome that in creating your program? How are you able to make this more specific to person?
So if you don't know this already about me, I've been type 1 diabetic for coming up on 22 years now. On October 29th, I'll mark 22 years since I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. So over that period of time, I've been able to experiment with, a number of different ways of exercising and seeing how different types of exercise affect my blood glucose levels, and then seeing how different types of exercise affect blood glucose levels of other type 1 diabetics. And so there are some very consistent themes that started to develop from this. And then from there, understanding that there are other variables that need to be considered with diabetes that most exercise programs just flat out don't consider. And these end up being some of the bigger variables that you have to consider when exercising with diabetes. Look, a lot of the exercise advice for type 1 diabetics, the variables that they say is, okay, well, you need to, watch how much food you eat and watch how much insulin you have on board. And yes, both of those are true, but those are far and away not the biggest variables that have to be considered when you're a type 1 diabetic and when you're exercising. But if you don't understand what to look for when it comes to what things might influence blood glucose levels as it relates to exercise, you're not going to understand what variables need to be considered above and beyond how much insulin you have on board and when the last time you ate was. And so by just through my own experience, and then being able to take what I learned in the classroom from a master's program and understanding how exercise affects blood glucose and how exercise can influence the transportation of glucose from the bloodstream into the cells themselves, you're able to create you're able to create a specific exercise program and manipulate the intended variables in order to better manage blood glucose levels accordingly.
Wow, that's a lot. I mean, I don't have type 1 diabetes, and when I exercise, I just think, throw my shoes on and maybe have a snack and get going. And so that seems like a lot to consider, and I'm sure that the people that are going to participate in your program will deeply appreciate all the thought you've put into those types of details. Talk to us more about the importance of exercise when you have type 1 diabetes. I know that you and I always say it's so important, and we talk about in our podcast all the reasons why it could be for your mechanics and different aspects of your health, but what specific things should type 1 diabetics be aware of that exercise can help manipulate or change or maintain in their bodies?
So one of the biggest concerns with type 1 diabetes is not being able to effectively manage your blood glucose levels. And that this is a topic, a consistent theme that's going to come up, throughout this podcast, but throughout the Fit4T1D program, because that far and away is the biggest concern, whether your blood glucose gets too high, whether your blood glucose gets too low. So you have to be able to effectively manage your blood glucose when you're type 1 diabetic. So when it comes to exercising and managing your blood glucose levels, you have to understand that exercise itself can help promote something called insulin sensitivity, okay? In other words, that the insulin that type 1 diabetics are not able to produce themselves, when they go and exercise, they need less of it in order to get the same effect of shuttling the glucose from the bloodstream into the cells, okay? So that's a really, really big thing, is that exercise is going to help promote insulin sensitivity, which means as a type 1 diabetic, you need to take less insulin overall, all right? So that's a really awesome thing. Furthermore, you can manipulate the types of exercising that you're doing in order to gain more insulin sensitivity than you otherwise would from your exercise. So understanding that, okay? The other thing that exercise is going to do is going to help kind of maintain the overall health of the muscle function, okay? The health of, make sure that your joints are working well, make sure that, your nervous system stays working well, because as your body gets more stress, whether it's more emotional stress, whether it's more physical stress, whatever, that's going to create greater fluctuations within your blood glucose levels as well, okay? You can say get into a really angry state, and that will shoot your blood glucose levels way up. All right. So by having, yet at the same time, you can be in a really calm state and, have your blood glucose levels stay more steady. So then, how exercise ties into that. Hey, if you can exercise in a manner that helps promote the health and function of your muscles, of your joints, that is, helps promote the health and function of your nervous system, it will help to minimize the stressful swings that can happen with your blood glucose levels when you are exercising in a manner that's inappropriate for your body. So exercise can be very beneficial in both those regards, in helping to just kind of keep blood glucose levels stable, as well as in helping to make sure that your insulin sensitivity stays high as well.
Yeah, weren't you, I think we were having a conversation a while back, and you had mentioned something about the time between your workouts can even affect the sensitivity of insulin, almost like if you spend more than 48 hours or something, you had said, then you start noticing a decrease in sensitivity and you have to start giving yourself more insulin. Was there something that you had said about that? Because I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, so this goes for not just type 1 diabetics, but
okay.
All people. If you are going more than 48 hours without exercising, you're going to start to notice that your insulin sensitivity starts to diminish. In other words, your kind of resting, fasting blood glucose levels will start to slowly creep up. Okay. Now it's easier to monitor within type 1 diabetic because they are constantly checking their blood glucose levels. So the data is really easy to see within the type 1 diabetic community. And so with the whole idea of exercise promoting insulin sensitivity, you get a little bit of a carryover effect from one day to the next, and it can help to reverse if you're starting to become more resistant to your insulin. It can help reverse those processes and then help to make sure that on the days when you're not exercising for whatever reason, you stay more sensitive to your insulin. But the frequency with which you're exercising is super important. So you have to be exercising at least, every other day.
Nice. I know that I follow you on Instagram and watch your stories, and I think you also had mentioned that in part of you do daily, informational bits, and I think that's really cool. But that's one of the things I picked up, and that's cool that it applies to all people, and that it's kind of a scary thing too, because we don't get to, if I'm not checking my blood glucose, a couple times a day, so I don't ever get to see that. Mm-hmm. And if I'm taking a week off from working out, I don't actually see that because my body just takes care of it and I don't even know.
Right. And the thing is like, if you take a week off from exercise, you might not notice that, say, the blood glucose levels themselves creep up because your body might just start to pump out more insulin in response. Oh, but that might be, so we're rarely necessarily measuring our insulin levels. We're mostly measuring the blood glucose levels. So outside looking in, it might be like, oh, your blood glucose levels are just fine. But your body's having to produce more insulin in order to manage those blood glucose levels.
I see. Yeah. And probably that would lead to issues down the road if you did week after week after week after year of not exercising.
Absolutely.
And that's probably, it would be a big contributor to type 2 diabetes, that you lose that sensitivity.
Yes.
Just from lack of exercise.
Right, exactly.
A contributor maybe.
Yep.
So Charlie, tell us more specifics about your program. I know there's a big strength training component to it, and I know there's some one-on-one time people get with you. Mm-hmm. Tell us about how that works.
So the program itself is just completely customized for the person that's working through it. So it's not like a standardized program that, you'd get a workout DVD and, all right, this is the program that everybody does. It starts with an assessment, and I have guided videos to help people, work through the assessment, and then they do the assessment, they fill out the assessment, they send it back to me, and then based on those results, then I build an exercise program from scratch for them based on their time availability, schedule, how much time they're able to dedicate every time they work out. But more importantly, or at least equally as important, is how their joints are doing, how their shoulders are moving, how their hips are moving, how their trunk is moving, whether they have any pain or tightness when they're moving in certain directions, whether it's more difficult to move in certain ways. And so taking all that into consideration, then able to kind of build an exercise program from the ground up that's built for their body. So again, this whole idea of like, hey, exercise is something that should promote the health of your body. And so if it's done appropriately, it shouldn't be excessively stressful, like excessively negatively stressful. With that idea at the forefront, we have to figure out a way to build exercise from the ground up for people. And so this assessment is what allows me to do that. So we start with the assessment, and then again, I just start at 4 weeks, build a 4-week program from there, whether it's 2 days a week or 3 days a week for somebody. And, based on how much time they want to spend exercising, we'll kind of customize it for that as well.
Great. And just to be clear, this is people would sign up online.
Yes.
And then do they speak with you on the phone or?
Yes. So they go to www.fit4t1d.com. So fit for the number 4, T, the number 1, and then D.com. And, that's the kind of initial page, and they can find out more information about the program there. Sure. But then right now, you click on the Apply Now button. So you click on the Apply Now button, and it takes you right to that initial application. And once you fill out that application, then we schedule a time to kind of talk on the phone and figure out, what would be feasible for you.
Beautiful. I love that because, first, I don't know any exercise program that includes a assessment that you would do on your own body to figure out your own body's abilities and limitations and where it's doing really well and doing not very well. So I'm sure there's probably not one out there specific for individuals with type 1 diabetes. So that brings a huge piece to it. And as you mentioned, that these negative stressors, whether it's emotional or physical, can change the management of blood glucose. This assessment will probably really help individuals be able to manage that stress level on their bodies so that they're not having these big swings as much, if I'm thinking correctly.
Exactly. And that's the whole idea behind it is, we need to make sure that the exercise is safe. We need to make sure that the exercise is going to be appropriate for somebody, but we also make an appropriate ties in with not being super stressful for somebody's body. And if we're trying to help people better manage their blood glucose levels with exercise, well, that's a pretty fundamental component.
Yeah. Another thing you brought up that I really love, that I know we've talked about in other podcasts, but I want to bring it up again because it is such an important point, where when we exercise and we believe we're doing it to bring our bodies closer to this idea of health, a lot of times, whatever our main focus is, that's all we want to focus on. For example, if you're trying to lose weight, you just want to do exercise that promotes weight loss. Or if you're exercising to manage your type 1 diabetes, then you're always thinking about exercise relative to your blood glucose levels or how to help you manage that. But what we have to remember is, what does exercise entail? And in the core of exercise, it is challenging muscles, and there's probably a likelihood that you're going to be using and or putting forces through your joints. And so in the meantime, while you're losing weight or while you're managing your blood glucose or trying to become a healthier type 1 diabetic, we have to make sure you're also not making your muscles and joints less healthy. So that's a really cool piece that I think is oftentimes kind of looked at as a hurdle, but it's actually a huge almost springboard towards a better exercise program.
Absolutely. I mean, that was one of the biggest issues that I was saying when I was researching, exercise and type 1 diabetes, is that when exercise advice was given, it was essentially the exact same advice that you would find for a non type 1 diabetic. Okay. So first of all, how is that exercise advice then specific for a type 1 diabetic? It's not. Okay. So it's missing that component. But then the other issue is, like we've talked about a lot before, if you have knee issues or you have back issues, well, is squatting really the thing that you should be doing? And so to write just, this general program of, okay, well, day 1, you're going to squat, and day 2, you're going to bench press, and day 3, you're going to, it's like, who are you telling should be doing that? And so, combining that ignorance with the flat out misinformation that was being given from an exercise perspective, and then saying, oh, okay, well, you're type 1 diabetic, and type 1 diabetic is a great SEO term, so I'm going to combine the two, and hey, here we go, here's an exercise program for type 1 diabetics. What? That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So that was just the tip of the iceberg of the issues I was seeing when it came to exercise advice as given for type 1 diabetics. And so the assessments are a really big part of that.
Sure. And this program, you don't have to be in Schaumburg or accessible to our studio to do it, right?
No.
Everything's online.
Everything's online. And so as long as you have access to a gym or workout equipment, then you're good to go. So yeah, we do it all online, and everything's videotaped. So you have all the information that you need right there. And, like I said, we have weekly Facebook Live calls that we do to answer questions, bi-weekly telephone calls to make sure that everything's good to go with you. But then we run everything through Google Drive, so it makes it really accessible. As long as you have, a Google account, which is completely free, then you're able to access all the files and everything. Right.
So tell us what exactly is included if you decide to sign up for this program. I know you can pick your days and you do your own assessment, but how much access to you do we get? And I know you have this cool Facebook thing going on. Tell us about that, what's included here.
Sure. So like you had alluded to, there is the private Fit4T1D Facebook group. And so that is for anybody that is interested in exercise, type 1 diabetes, and how to better manage type 1 diabetes through exercise. Okay, so you can request to join that group. There are a few questions that you have to answer, and then based on those responses, we'll get into the group. And so from there, so you get that community, and that's a growing community. Obviously, there's the Instagram account, and so I post to both 5 times a week, Monday through Friday. Additionally, at least once a week, I do a Facebook Live from the closed Fit4T1D Facebook group. Okay, so that's only for people that are in that group, where I'm answering questions that people are asking me via Instagram, via email, via Facebook message, and answering the questions that are being sent to me regarding exercise and type 1 diabetes. Okay, so you get information in that regard. Then also, me and you set up times to have phone calls to kind of help you through the program, check in, make sure that everything's going all right. And then as far as all additional access to me, you also have my email address where you can, send me emails and stuff. And if you follow me on Instagram with the Fit4T1D, you can always message me through that as well.
Sure. So the only thing that you actually would have to sign up for with the program would be to do the program. The private Facebook group and the Instagram page you could follow and be participating in, even if you didn't sign up for the program.
Yes, absolutely.
Did I get that right?
Yeah,
okay.
For sure.
But we just want to make sure that the private Facebook group is really specific to the topic of type 1 diabetes and exercise.
Exactly.
I see.
Yep.
Now, Charlie, we've been starting to talk about the uniqueness in how the program begins, with the assessment, making it customized. But tell us more about, the meat of the program. How is it going to be different than just this general activity recommendation that we're given by, our doctors or, online and other programs? So give us some insight on that, because I think that'll be where people really start seeing the big changes.
Exactly. So there are 4 main variables that need to be considered if you're a type 1 diabetic when you're exercising, okay? And 2 of these variables are commonly discussed, and the other 2 are hardly ever touched on. The issue is the 2 that are hardly ever touched on are two of the biggest ones, okay? So the two that are discussed all the time is, how much insulin do you have on board and how much food have you eaten, all relative to your blood glucose levels. And yes, those are absolutely important. Look, if your blood glucose levels is 120 and you have 5 units of insulin on board and you pre-bolused yourself because you're about to eat, like now's not the time to go work out. You're going to drop low, all right? So you have to absolutely keep those things in mind. But what tends to have a much bigger impact, okay, on how much somebody's blood glucose levels fluctuate, and so far and away, the number one variable that needs to be considered that I found when it comes to exercise and type 1 diabetes is what I'm calling the intensity of the exercise, okay? So whether you are exercising really lightly, whether you're going really, really hard, or whether you're going somewhere in between, okay? Because here's the thing with exercise and type 1 diabetes. Sometimes exercise will cause your blood glucose levels to drop too low. And that's the thing that we always hear about with exercise and type 1 diabetes. Oh, we went for a run and we dropped low, okay? But sometimes exercise can cause your blood glucose levels to skyrocket, all right? And if you don't understand the conditions under which one happens versus the other, it's just a shot in the dark every time as far as, okay, well, what's going to happen with my blood glucose levels when I go to exercise? Fingers crossed, everything's all right. And the number one variable that's going to influence whether or not your blood glucose levels drop or whether they skyrocket is going to be the intensity with which you are exercising, okay? So generally speaking, lower intensity exercise is going to drop your blood glucose levels, whereas high intensity exercise is going to spike your blood glucose levels, all right? Now, I remember being newly diagnosed, all right? So I got diagnosed at age 9. I remember being 10, 11, 12 years old and feel like, how come every time I go for a walk, just a light walk, I always drop low, but whenever I play basketball, I'm okay? Like, that didn't make any sense to me, but now I realize. And the issue is the more intensely you're working out, the more cortisol you're going to release. So one of the things cortisol is going to do is it's going to go to the liver and cause glycogen to be broken down into glucose. So glycogen gets released from the liver, it gets broken down into glucose. And so when you're doing these higher intensity bouts of exercise, you're releasing more cortisol, all right? When you release more cortisol, you're going to end up with more glucose in your blood because more glycogen gets released and then broken down, all right? So if you don't understand that, you might be wondering, okay, well, how come every time I go to lift weights, my blood glucose level goes up, and how come every time I go to do cardio, my blood glucose levels drop, all right? Because most people, when they do cardio, they're not doing cardio intensely enough, and most people, when they go to lift weights, they're not lifting weights in an appropriate manner, and so it ends up being really stressful to their body. As such, releasing more cortisol, spiking their blood glucose levels, okay? So understanding the intensity with which you're exercising. Just as an example, with myself, I can go for a run, completely fasted and have my blood glucose levels fluctuate between 90 and 120 the entire time, all right? And not drop super low, not go up super high, but because I've figured out the intensity that I need to exercise at with my own body, in order to make up for the glucose that I'm losing by having it just intense enough that I release enough cortisol to get enough glycogen breakdown to then get enough glucose replenished back into the blood, all right? So figuring out the intensity with which you need to work out in order to not drop low and not spike high is a really important thing as a type 1 diabetic. And this is something that's completely overlooked, that people just flat out aren't talking about. They talk about it generally with, cardio dropping you low, lifting weights bringing you up high. But that, again, is just too general to be of any help whatsoever, because it's not about cardio, it's not about weightlifting, it's about how you're doing each and the intensity of which you're doing each.
Yeah, I can see how, number one, I didn't know any of that. So that's really, really interesting. But number two, I can see how just that knowledge and learning about your own exercise and how you're going to do that exercise can really help someone with type 1 diabetes regain a piece of control, because now you have this extra piece of knowledge or, nugget in your brain to better take into consideration, so that when you're exercising, not just like, well, here we go again, I'm just going to be out of control, and then I'll, an hour or two later, or however long it takes to regain control, I'll figure it out, and everything will be back to normal. But if you're able to exercise and not have that crazy, I don't know which way it's going to go, that's really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's a game changer. I remember when I was in high school, I felt like I didn't know which way my blood glucose was going to go. I felt like I needed to have my blood glucose levels, way above 180 at least before I could start working out, because I always thought, I would drop down, but at least half the time I'd end up spiking high. And so it was always this kind of total shot in the dark as far as, well, what's going to happen with my blood glucose levels. And so over time, kind of figuring it out, it makes a tremendous difference. Now, the fourth variable that needs to be considered, so we have insulin on board, we have the amount of food on board, all relative to blood glucose levels. You have the number one variable that has to be considered, which is the intensity. And then finally, you also have to consider the time of day with which you're working out. Now, the reason why this is important is because, as many type 1 diabetics know, you experience something called the dawn phenomenon, which means your blood glucose levels can be at between, say, 70 and 80 the entire night, and then all of a sudden you wake up, you start going, and as the sun rises, you might spike up to 120, 130, 140, or even above that. So in the morning time, you might get this natural rise of your blood glucose levels, okay? So this dawn phenomenon effect. Well, so compare that to, say, what might happen in the middle of the day, as you're approaching lunch, blood glucose levels might drop, or, in the evening time, again, as you're approaching dinner, blood glucose levels might drop. All right. Now, while this is slightly different for every person, the dawn phenomena effect seems to be a relatively consistent trend from type 1 diabetic to type 1 diabetic, okay? Again, the fluctuations, the amount of fluctuations may differ though. But here's the thing, as a type 1 diabetic, if you realize that you're going to have the dawn phenomenon, that's something that you can take advantage of when you're exercising. If your blood glucose levels are just naturally spiking throughout the morning, that might be a great time for you to work out, all right? Because exercise should help to better regulate that. So that might be a great time for you to work out. Additionally, let's say you are a lunchtime worker-outer, all right? Well, understanding that, your blood glucose levels might be dropping during that time if you're working out before you eat lunch, okay? Or if you, say, don't eat breakfast in the morning and then you don't eat until lunch, that can affect things. Working out later in the evening might be a bigger issue for type 1 diabetics, because if you work out, say, at like 7 or 8 p.m. at night, and then you plan to go to bed at 9:30, 10 o'clock, well, now you have very little time after you finished exercising to see how your blood glucose levels are going to respond to that exercise, all right? So understanding how your blood glucose levels fluctuate throughout the day, but then also how exercise is going to affect it differently at different times of day is a really big thing as well.
Nice. So we have food on board, insulin on board, all relative to blood glucose levels. Mm-hmm. We have intensity of the exercise you're about to do, yep, and timing relative to the day.
Yes.
Yeah. So these four variables, are you talking about all these four things in the program?
Absolutely. I mean,
okay.
This is the cornerstone pieces of content that I make for the Instagram, for the Facebook pages. All of that is about these four variables. But additionally, in the program itself, it's something that we discuss. It needs to be considered. Okay, what time of day are you going to be working out? What trends do you see, with your blood glucose levels earlier in the morning, later in the evening, things like that. And then intensity, far and away, is the biggest one. Most diabetics are well accustomed to managing their food and managing their insulin,
right,
and maybe kind of tracking their blood glucose throughout the day, but intensity ends up being the one that most people are unfamiliar with, and so the one that the program spends the majority of the time focusing on.
That's great. Do you think that with these variables, type 1 diabetics become a lot more comfortable with exercise? And second question, do you think a lot of type 1 diabetics are uncomfortable with exercise just because of the changes that happen when they exercise with their blood glucose? So
both questions from the type 1 diabetics I've spoken with and the survey results I've gotten, both questions tend to be yes. Okay. Most type 1 diabetics are uncomfortable with exercising because they don't know what's going to happen with their blood glucose levels. And it seems like such a shot in the dark every time. And then understanding how to manage these variables becomes something that, one, they were unaware of, but two, an absolute necessity when it comes to managing the blood glucose levels during and after exercise.
Yeah, and I was just thinking in terms of like a practical standpoint. I mean, it's one thing, you know, when you were a college athlete and, you know, maybe for younger type 1 diabetics, like their whole world is, especially if you're an athlete or active, is being active and being an athlete. But eventually your life becomes, you have other responsibilities like taking care of your kids or showing up to work so that you can keep your job. And for this thing that's called exercise to be such a whirlwind of an hour, you don't know what's going to happen before or after. It's like, well, great. Now I might feel crappy all day after or until I get a handle or until lunch or whatever. So that's a really cool piece I didn't even think of until you were just saying that because, I mean, the population you and I work with, which is just people trying to be healthy, you know, they've got a life. It's not like exercise can just be the life, you know, and then recovering from it or preparing for it or whatever. So I like the streamlining process that you've added. That's really, really cool.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah, it's been a fun project. So
to wrap it up, let's talk about how people can connect with you and get more information about this program.
Definitely. So go to the website. That's www.fit4t1d.com. And it's FIT, the number 4, T, the number 1, D.com. So fitness for type 1 diabetics.com. Okay. And so that would be the starting place. You can check out Fit4T1D on Instagram, search it on Facebook, and ask to get added to the private group. All those areas would help as well. And then if you want to connect with me directly about it, you can always connect with me through the Instagram account at Fit4T1D, or feel free to send me an email about it as well. It's just charlie@Schaumburg.com, and that would be a great way to connect with me too.
Awesome. So if you know of anyone or you yourself have type 1 diabetes, please share this podcast with them, because I know that this program is going to completely change how you yourself or your loved ones will be exercising with type 1 diabetes. And as we just heard from Charlie, it is massively important that not only all of us are exercising, but especially if you are living with this condition, which is clearly highly manageable. So that's really cool. So anyways, shoot Charlie an email, tag someone in this post, and make sure that the people that need to hear this podcast are able to reach this information. We would really, really appreciate it if you head on over to iTunes or to your podcast listening platform of choice and leave us a review. Subscribe so that you get this podcast every single Wednesday when it comes out. And we really appreciate your time in listening. Of course, as usual, we always do Q&A. So if you do have a question for us, even if it's related specifically to this exercise topic of fitness for type 1 diabetics, please send it over to our email. You can either email directly to Charlie at MAT Schaumburg, as he just gave, or you can email us at our info@MATSchaumburg.com. Have a great week, and we'll catch you all next week.